The answer to the question of unity, or pluralism, is ultimately decided on the basis of an epistemological standpoint. It is about whether absolute knowledge is possible regardless of the sensory nature of the knower. Absolute knowledge means unity, subjective nature means pluralism. The fundamental problem has been discussed over the centuries from a variety of perspectives, but it is still not possible to plausibly answer how something individual can become something general, or how sensuality and reason can be brought into logical agreement. And it is precisely in this point that postmodernism differs from modernity. The Enlightenment thinkers operated with a concept of truth that is derived from the correspondence between word and thing. Truth correlates with reality, or reality is represented by language. The method of identification or illustration was used. A sheep is a sheep. A thing is what you can see, feel, hear, etc. Real things are positively given. There's no need to interpret around. You believe you have a safe, self-evident starting point that is immune to any doubt. Things are what they are and nothing else. Different in pluralism. Wolfgang Welch justifies it as untranscendable equality between highly different forms of knowledge, rationality, life and action. Welch also calls this the basic experience of postmodernism. In Lyotard, pluralism follows from the conviction that agreement on universally valid rules is illusory. But universally valid rules are not the same as universally valid rules. Anyone who believes that all countries in the world who joined the United Nations will then achieve unanimous results in all votes has a rather unrealistic view of the power of one's statutes. One may also doubt whether an organization such as the United Nations makes any sense at all. However, it is undisputed that a large number of states have joined this organization, and they will have had their reasons for doing so under international law. In principle, one can object to the establishment of norms, and thus rules and laws, but this one cannot provide a plausible reason for doing so. Avoiding and combating arbitrary violence through rules is reason enough in any case. However, it can be questionable how such norms come about, how they are legitimized, and also how they are interpreted. Assuming that a legal system is not a continuation of physical violence by other means, which is never really ruled out, Rudolf von Jhering, a respected legal scholar, for example, defines law as a politics of violence. If one does not assume this, then compliance with a legal system is the principle that a norm that is superior to personal arbitrariness must be recognized and is also recognized. Violations of such a legal system must be prosecuted and punished. This is the basic consensus that Rousseau called the social contract in the 18th century. The next question is actually whether such a legal system delivers what it promises, and on this question one can have different opinions. But as I said, there are plausible reasons why the principle of a well-considered overarching norm is a good and reasonable thing when a larger number of people form a community. There is hardly any possibility of protecting a group of people against the power and violence of another, even against the state, without recognizing a higher authority such as the law. Law and order are intended to prevent violent or fraudulent attacks from occurring either by the general public or by individuals. It should be noted that the right to a self-imposed order cannot be disputed by anyone, as long as this takes place within the framework of existing laws. Blaise Pascal already describes the interference in matters that concern no one else, nothing but tyranny. It is natural to assume that states have created their own laws. The territory of a state is also the place where members of other nationalities are subject to local law. In addition, There are all sorts of rules and regulations that members of interest groups, clubs or partnerships have set for themselves, and in which you have to expect exclusion or sanctions if you ignore the statutes that apply there. So there are already lots of types of discourse and language games, if you will, that function according to postmodern principles. Club matters are regulated internally. A certain purpose requires an agreement to be reached regarding the meaning of a concept, as is stated in The Differend, in a thesis on page 10. Above all the many small orders of clubs and societies, there is always the higher order of law, which protects the freedoms of the various language games. At first glance, what Lyotard is demanding doesn't seem all that different from what is already happening. But Lyotard still sees plenty of problems that he noticed with unfulfilled promises dating back to the Enlightenment era. Above all, it is the totalitarian attitude that he links to the universal validity of a one and only logic, a universal rationality and reason. This terror of modern reason is the central power to which far too many freedoms are subordinated. Rationality has always been linked to the idea of universality. In Lyotard, however, the concept of everyone, from whom Kant could demand the validity of his tenets, no longer exists. Lyotard believes that he has said goodbye to generality. He only knows the local consensus. He alone can ensure justice by resolving every disagreement and conflict, here and now. The pluralistic game is fair if anyone who wants to play is allowed to play. What role reality plays in the cognitive language game is not really clear from Lyotard. In addition to relativistic, pluralistic, decentralized tendencies, there are also numerous objectivistic tendencies in his writings. The position of Wolfgang Welch, the German chronicler of postmodernism, is, however, easy to identify. For Welch, the reason for the plurality of views lies in what he calls a simple key experience, which is that one and the same fact can appear completely differently from another point of view. This other perspective has no less light, as Welch says, than the other, just a different one. However, Welch only comes to his conclusion that the different perspectives are equal through the assumption of an absolute reality that serves him as a reference point, a reality that, like zero in mathematics, has no content itself but is useful in a logical derivation. Because only in relation to this reality in itself does every subjective point of view have equal rights, according to the motto, all points of view are equal before God, or to use Hilary Putnam's formulation, in God's view. If this common third factor is no longer used as a comparison criterion, then each observation comes about from its own point of view and, viewed logically, is incommensurable with every other point of view, if you will, equally incommensurable. But only viewed from a purely logical point of view. If one assumes that every type of community requires rules in order to be recognizable as a community, one can assume that an order is somehow legitimized. If this is the case, the purposes pursued in such a community can also be compared in terms of their ethical value. As a rule, human societies are organized as legal systems, whereby the enforcement of law is guaranteed by the state monopoly on the use of force. The legal system serves as a benchmark and norm for even talking about entitlement or equality to be able to. So the crucial question is whether the state's laws are accepted or not. Without such exception, there is no consistency and commitment in thinking and acting that does not only affect one's own club, because which institution should then be able to grant any authorization. State or moral laws are a result of practical, pragmatic considerations to ensure a non-violent order. For Rudolf von Jhering, it was a foregone conclusion that the legal idea had its origins in the purpose. One does not necessarily have to share this view, but it is clear that logic, truth and reality are only of functional importance in jurisprudence, that is, only in relation to the question of whether a violation of the law is taking place. This is exactly how the role of language is assessed and terms are interpreted. Lawyers differ from ordinary mortals in that they view legal texts and their terms in their context and in their superiority and subordination, which is quite different from the linguistic habits of average citizens who have no training in this regard. What Fritz Mautner said about philosophical concepts, that the chance of the small personal experience determines what the individual imagines when hearing the words, applies not only to philosophical concepts, but also to all concepts. If you look at the simplest objects of practical everyday life, there is hardly a concept that cannot be expanded and made more precise through a greater interest in the matter, so that a level of meaning is added with each additional piece of information. Trying to understand something, in itself, is meaningless. That's why also the criticism of postmodern thinking, because it leads to an overemphasis on the semantic meaning. The so-called too muchness becomes obsolete the moment the objectivist standpoint of the in itself is abandoned, because an infinite variety of meanings only exists in the in itself mode, but not in the myself mode, because I sort out. Lyotard's speech about the infinite arbitrariness or contingency of the chain of concepts, or about a language as an infinite, beginningless and endless network, or the inaccessibility of a real reference of meaning, as Derrida says, is also irrelevant, because said infinity only exists in itself, but not for me. Everything that is asserted in itself happens from a standpoint of power, by dealing exclusively with generalities. Without this aspect of power, statements in themselves are worthless. For Derrida, it is clear that the meaning of an expression can never be fully determined. A totalization from which no remainder escapes will always remain an unfulfilled need. Even the most comprehensive definitions still leave open 1,000 possibilities, according to Derrida. But Derrida's conclusion is only valid if it refers to an absolute point of view. In itself, each meaning refers to another and one connection gives rise to the next, so that there is no end in sight. But if a concrete subject is the point of reference, things are not valid in themselves. But, for me, then I decide on the meaning that seems to me to be the most reasonable and useful. It may also have become clear to me that I don't know enough about a matter to be able to make an acceptable judgment. Then the decision is postponed or left open altogether. Derrida's claim that everything is text has no relevance for me. In itself, nothing is anything. Not everything is symbolic and is therefore a sign system of a never-resting process of reference, as Derrida puts it. Such objectivism only applies to a world in which universality reigns. It is therefore pointless to mourn the absolutely correct interpretation, or to want to fully exploit the semantic potential of a text. You might as well throw a lasso at the moon. This is why statements in The Differend, for example page 125, are so irritating. When Lyotard speaks of a universe of meanings endlessly chained together, the confusion is completed by the remark on page 148, where one dreams of the noble task of researching unambiguity. No less strange is Lyotard's talk of certain abilities that enable sensually affected subjects to suddenly know that something, that is, a meaning, is trying to put itself into sentences. The role of the subject is that of a purely passive recipient who receives, so to speak, a divine revelation. A view he shares with Derrida, who also believes that the subject is rather powerless in the face of language and does not have much to say. This argument reminds me of the attempt by realists who feel oppressed by relativism and now admit that every observation is dependent on a certain perspective, but at the same time add that there are always, potentially, an infinite number of possible perspectives. Which then means that every object of perception is exposed, in itself, to an infinity of representations. The fascists have also taken advantage of such a sophistic relativism of fundamental arbitrariness, which makes all views appear both wrong and right, so that everything that is affirmed from one point of view can also be denied from another. As Horkheimer shows using the example of Mussolini. At the beginning of the 20th century, the modern fascist, or relativist, believed that every person has the right to create their own truth, because all truths are just fictions anyway. Which is why you can then assert your own truth with all your energy and sometimes not squeamishly, that is, even walk over dead bodies. Lyotard has nothing to counteract this power problem with his, "Let everyone play in peace." Relativistic arbitrariness can only be overcome through nonpartisan norms in which the principle of internal logic is accepted as a higher law, so that contradictions continue to be unacceptable. The choice of point of view is free, but once the point of view has been taken, the perspective is also fixed and can be checked for inconsistencies, so that the fraud is at least made more difficult, if it cannot be completely eliminated. Wolfgang Welch also exhibits a disguised objectivism that comes across as relativism and pluralism. Welch thinks that there are several possible answers to the question, what man is, i.e., the question about the nature of man, one philosophical, one sociological, etc. But, and now comes the conclusion, by choosing one of these answers, it will inevitably come at the expense of others, says Welch. Welch doesn't come up with the idea that the question about the in itself of man is bullshit at all. The essentialism of a being is retained in every answer, only that the essence is first justified philosophically, then sociologically, etc. An irrelevant relativism is being unleashed simply because the universalism of an essence in itself cannot be abandoned as a logical point of reference.